The air at the Henderson Farm auction hung thick and heavy, a humid mix of diesel exhaust, stale coffee, and the quiet desperation of a family losing everything. It was late summer, 1976. The corn stood tall and green in the fields surrounding the farmstead. A bitter irony that the crop belonged to the bank now, not the man who planted it. Jedediah Stone stood near the back of the crowd, his arms crossed over his chest, his knuckles stained with the kind of grease that soap and water only seemed to drive deeper into the skin. He wasn't here to buy big. He was here to watch, to learn, and maybe, if the price was right, to pick up a few worn-out implements he could cannibalize for parts. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man with a sweat-stained straw hat, was working the crowd into a frenzy over a set of nearly new disc harrows. But that wasn't the main event. The centerpiece of the sale, parked like a fallen giant in the center of the yard, was a Massey Ferguson 760 combine. It was only 2 years old, the red paint still gleaming, the cab looking like the cockpit of an airplane with its tinted glass and array of levers and gauges. It was a machine built for a future of endless prosperity, a testament to the belief that prices would only ever go up. Its presence on the auction block was a testament to the lie. "All right, folks, the moment you've been waiting for," the auctioneer bellowed, his voice cracking through the old PA system. The pride of the Henderson operation, a 1974 Massey Ferguson 760, Perkins diesel, hydrostatic drive, air conditioning that'll freeze you out on a hot day. Who'll start the bidding at $40,000? $40,000 for a machine that's barely broken in. A murmur went through the crowd. $40,000 was more than some farms were worth just a decade ago. Jed watched as Richard Miller, rich to everyone, swaggered to the front. Rich was young, maybe a year or two younger than Jed's 30 years, but he carried himself like he owned the county. He'd inherited a good piece of ground from his father, but instead of farming it, he'd used it as collateral to borrow and expand at a dizzying pace. He wore clean, new blue jeans and a seed corn cap that didn't have a single drop of sweat on it. "I'll give you 35, Rich called out, a smirk playing on his lips. He wasn't bidding, he was making a statement. The auctioneer didn't miss a beat. 35 I have, now who'll give me 36? 36,000. The bidding was brisk at first, driven by the heady optimism of 75-cent corn having become $3 corn almost overnight. A few other younger farmers, flush with bank credit, jumped in. But Rich was relentless. Every time the bid slowed, he'd jump it up by another 1,000, his voice confident, almost bored. He was playing a different game than the rest of them. Jed stayed put, leaning against the rusty fender of an old grain wagon. He knew the story. Henderson had bought the combine and a new 4-wheel drive tractor on the promise of high prices. He'd bought the farm next to him too. Then his wife got sick, the hospital bills piled up, and one bad crop was all it took for the whole house of cards to collapse. The bank didn't care about sick wives or droughts. They cared about the signature on the loan document. The bidding stalled at 48,000. The auctioneer tried his best, his chant becoming more frantic. 48,000 once, 48,000 twice, sold for $48,000 to Mr. Richard Miller. A polite ripple of applause went through the crowd as Rich casually signed the clerk's paperwork. He turned, and his eyes landed on Jed. He sauntered over, the smirk now a full-blown, condescending grin. "Still kicking the tires on the junk pile, Jed?" Rich asked, his voice loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Thought you might be looking for a new hood ornament for that old gleaner of yours." Jed just looked at him, his face impassive. His combine was an old Alice Chalmers Gleaner E, a machine most guys had sent to the scrapyard years ago. It was loud, dusty, and had no cab to speak of, but it was his. Every nut, every bolt, paid for in cash. "She runs," Jed said, his voice a low rumble. "Yeah, she runs," Rich laughed, shaking his head. "So does my granddaddy's old Farmall M. But I don't try to farm 600 acres with it. You know, Jed, the bank down in town is practically giving money away. You could trade in that whole museum collection of yours and get into a machine like this." He gestured toward the massive Massey Ferguson. "Farm twice the land in half the time. That's how you get ahead." "I'm getting by," Jed said, his gaze unwavering. "Getting by?" Rich scoffed. "Getting by is what you do when you're 80 years old. We're in the middle of a boom. This is the time to make a move, to build something. My father always said, you got to spend money to make money. Jed thought of his own father, a man whose hands had been as worn and calloused as old leather. He died 5 years ago, leaving Jed with the 160 acres of black dirt that had been in the Stone family for 3 generations. He'd also left him with a simple piece of advice, words Jed had heard so many times they were etched into his soul. Son, his father had said, standing by the old John Deere 4020, this land, these machines, they're all yours. No banker owns a single bolt, don't you ever forget that. If you can't hold the cash in your hand to pay for it, you can't afford it. Debt is a wolf that's always at the door, just waiting for you to stumble. Rich clapped Jed on the shoulder. Suit yourself. Some of us are building empires. Some of us are content to polish relics. I'll see you at the elevator. He walked away, leaving Jed standing in the shadow of the repossessed combine. The farmers nearby shuffled their feet, avoiding Jed's eyes. In their minds, Rich was right. Jed was a relic himself, a stubborn fool clinging to the past while the future was passing him by. Now, before we get any further into this story, I have to ask you all something, because it's important. Did your father or your grandfather ever give you a piece of advice that you brushed off at the time, or maybe you just nodded along but didn't truly understand? Advice that the world told you was outdated and old-fashioned. Let me know down in the comments what that advice was, because Jed Stone was holding on to his father's words like a lifeline, and the whole world was telling him to let go and drown with the rest of them. He was about to find out just how heavy that lifeline was, and whether it was strong enough to pull him through the storm that was gathering on the horizon. The harvest of '77 started under a sky the color of a faded blueprint. The corn had dried down fast, too fast, the kernels rattling in the husks like tiny stones. It was a race against time, a battle to get the crop out of the field before the autumn winds came and shelled it onto the ground. For Rich Miller, with his new-to-him Massey 760 and a brand-new International 1066 tractor, it was a simple matter of logistics. His operation was a picture of modern efficiency. For Jed, it was a different story. The old Gleaner E coughed to life each morning in a cloud of blue smoke, its 6-cylinder Alice Chalmers diesel engine settling into a familiar throaty roar. He'd spent the last week getting it ready, greasing every Zerk fitting until the old grease was pushed out by the new, checking the tension on every belt and chain, sharpening the sickle bar sections until they were like razor blades. He knew every clank, every groan, every vibration of that machine. It was an extension of his own body. He was halfway through his first 80-acre field when it happened. He was coming around the north end, the machine chewing through the dry stalks, the familiar rhythm of the thresher a comforting sound in his ears. Then there was a high-pitched squeal, followed by a sickening, grinding bang that vibrated through the steel operator's platform and up the soles of his boots. The whole machine shuddered violently. Jed instantly slammed the throttle back and killed the separator clutch. The engine idled down, but the silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the ticking of hot metal. He climbed down, his heart sinking into his stomach. A quick look told him the problem was deep in the guts of the machine. He spent the next hour pulling off inspection covers and guards, his hands and arms getting covered in a thick layer of greasy chaff. He found it at the main separator shaft. A bearing, one of the big pillow block bearings that carried the entire weight and force of the cylinder, had disintegrated. It hadn't just failed. It had come apart in spectacular fashion, sending steel balls like shrapnel into the surrounding machinery and scoring a deep, ugly groove into the 2-inch solid steel shaft. He sat back on his heels and cursed, a rare thing for him. This wasn't a simple fix. That bearing was a special order part, if it was even available anymore. And the damaged shaft, that was a disaster. The local dealer would just laugh at him. They hadn't stocked parts for a Gleaner E in 10 years. They'd just tried to sell him a new machine. He spent the rest of the day tearing it apart. Using a heavy 3-jaw puller and the heat from his oxyacetylene torch, he fought to get the remains of the bearing off the shaft. It was a miserable, soul-crushing job. Sweat dripped off his nose and sizzled on the hot steel. By dusk, he had the shaft out. It lay on the tailgate of his pickup truck like a casualty of war, the deep gouge mocking him. The next morning, he was at the door of Old Man Hemlock's machine shop before the sun was even up. Hemlock was a retired farmer who kept his shop running more as a hobby than a business. He could fix anything made of metal. He ran a gnarled finger over the groove in the shaft. "Well, Jed," he said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into a coffee can. "She's chewed up good and proper, can't just turn it down, you'll lose too much diameter. Bearing won't fit right." "Can you build it up, Frank? Weld it and turn it back to size?" Jed asked, the hope in his voice thin. Hemlock squinted at it. "Maybe. Take a lot of work. Have to preheat it just right, use a high nickel rod so it don't get brittle. Then spend half a day on the lathe, getting it perfect. It'll cost you." "I'll pay," Jed said without hesitation. "And the bearing," Hemlock added. "You'll have to find one of those yourself. I ain't a parts store." Jed spent the next 2 days on the phone, the old black rotary phone in his kitchen. He called every salvage yard in 3 states. Most of them just grunted and said they'd crushed all their old gleaners years ago. He was losing precious time. The sky was turning a hazy, ominous grey. The weather report on the radio was talking about a big storm system moving in from the west. As he was making his calls, he saw Rich Miller's operation in full swing across the road. The big Massey moved through the corn like a battleship, its grain tank extension meaning it could go for nearly an hour between unloads. A brand new grain truck shuttled the corn to the elevator, a continuous, seamless flow of productivity. One afternoon, Rich pulled his pickup to the end of Jed's lane. He got out and leaned against the fence, watching Jed wrestle with a stubborn bolt on the combine. "Having some trouble there, Stone?" Rich called over, the smugness dripping from his voice. Jed grunted, finally breaking the bolt loose with a loud crack. He wiped his forehead with the back of a greasy hand. "Just some maintenance." "Looks like a hell of a lot more than maintenance," Rich said, walking closer. "Look, I feel for you. I really do. Tell you what, I'll be done with my beans in 3, maybe 4 days. For 40% of your crop, I'll come over and knock out your corn for you before that storm hits. You won't have to lift a finger." Jed stood up straight, his back aching. 40%. It was blatant robbery. It was the kind of offer a wolf makes to a wounded deer. Jed looked him square in the eye. "Thanks for the offer, Rich, but I'll handle it." Rich just laughed, a short, sharp bark. "You're a proud fool, Jedediah. That pride is going to cost you. When your corn is lying flat on the ground next week, don't come crying to me." He turned and walked back to his truck, the dust from his tires hanging in the air long after he was gone. The scorn was palpable. At the co-op, the other farmers would stop talking when he walked in. They'd look at his greasy clothes and tired eyes and shake their heads. They were all talking about Rich Miller, about how he'd already sold half his crop on a forward contract for a great price, about the new center pivot irrigation system he was planning to install next year. Jed was a ghost, a reminder of a past they were all eager to escape. Finally, on the 3rd day, he got a lead, a salvage yard in northern Iowa. The old man who answered the phone sounded like he was 100 years old. "Yeah, Gleaner E. Might have one out in the back 40. Haven't looked at it in 20 years. If you want it, you come pull the parts yourself." Jed didn't hesitate. He threw his tools, the torch, and a thermos of coffee in his old Ford F-250 and drove the 4 hours north. The salvage yard was a graveyard of rusting iron, a sad, beautiful testament to generations of farming. He found the combine half swallowed by weeds and small trees. It took him 6 hours of cutting, heating, and swearing, but he got the shaft and both pillow block bearings out. They were worn, but they were intact. He paid the old man $100 cash and drove home through the night, the precious, greasy parts wrapped in burlap sacks on the seat beside him. The first fat drops of rain began to splatter against his windshield just as he pulled into his driveway. The storm had arrived. The 1970s rolled on, a decade of dizzying change. The price of land, tractors, and fertilizer seemed to be in a race to the sky, and for a while, commodity prices kept pace. The get big or get out philosophy that the university experts and the Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Butz, were preaching became the gospel of the heartland. Farmers were told to plant fence-a-row to fence-a-row, to borrow heavily, to leverage their rapidly appreciating land, to buy more land and bigger equipment. It was, everyone agreed, a golden era for American agriculture. Rich Miller was the poster child for this new era. He embodied it completely. The 40% of Jed's crop he didn't get that year was a minor inconvenience. The money was flowing so freely from the Production Credit Association that it didn't matter. After the harvest of 77, he bought the Henderson place outright. The next year, he bought another 80 acres that bordered his property to the east. His operation swelled to nearly 1,000 acres. To work it, he traded the Massey 760 for two brand-new International Harvester 1460 axial flow combines. He bought a monstrous Steiger Panther four-wheel drive tractor with duals on all four wheels, a machine that could pull a 30-foot chisel plow and make the ground tremble. His farmstead was transformed. A new machine shed went up, a massive steel structure that dwarfed his house. Then came the grain setup, two towering blue Harvestor silos and a new continuous flow grain dryer that could be heard humming from a mile away. Rich was no longer just a farmer, he was an agribusinessman. He was featured in the State Farming magazine, standing in front of his new Steiger, smiling confidently, the very picture of success. He was praised for his aggressive management style and his forward-thinking embrace of technology and credit. Jed, meanwhile, continued on his own quiet path. The storm in 77 had been a blow. He'd lost about a quarter of his corn, the wind and rain shelling the kernels onto the muddy ground. It hurt, but it didn't break him. Because he had no loan payments, no equipment notes, no credit line to pay off, he simply absorbed the loss. He sold his calves for a little less than he'd hoped, tightened his belt through the winter, and started again the next spring. The high grain prices of the era were good to him too. He had several profitable years in a row. The money he made went into a savings account at the local bank, earning a modest interest. He didn't buy new land. He didn't buy new equipment. He reinvested in what he had. One winter, he pulled the 303 cubic inch diesel engine out of his John Deere 4020. He carefully disassembled it on the clean concrete floor of his shop, laying each part out in order on a wooden bench. He took the block and the head to Frank Hemlock to have them checked for cracks. He ordered a complete overhaul kit, new pistons, sleeves, rings, bearings, and gaskets. He spent weeks meticulously cleaning every part, measuring every tolerance with his micrometers, carefully reassembling the engine with the focus of a surgeon. When he was done, he painted the whole engine classic John Deere green. That spring, the 4020 fired up with a crispness it hadn't had in years, its distinctive two-cylinder style exhaust note echoing across the fields, a sound of reliability, of paid-for power. He bought a used grain truck, a 1968 Chevrolet C60, with a 16-foot steel box and hoist. The engine was tired and the paint was faded, but the frame was solid. He paid $1,200 for it, cash. He spent another winter working on it, giving the 366 V8 engine a valve job, replacing the clutch, rewiring the lights, and putting on 6 new tires. He painted it himself, a coat of simple red primer. It wasn't pretty, but it was his, and it would haul just as much corn as a brand new one. His discipline was seen not as wisdom, but as a peculiar form of failure. At the co-op one morning, while waiting to unload his old Chevy, Rich Miller pulled up alongside in a gleaming new GMC tandem axle truck. "Still polishing that junk, Jed?" Rich yelled over the noise of the grain elevator. "You know, with the price of corn these days, you could have a new one paid off in 2 seasons. You're living in the past." Jed just nodded and smiled faintly. "This one gets the job done, Rich." "Yeah, if the job is making you look like you're broke," Rich shot back, laughing as he pulled ahead in the line. The whispers followed Jed everywhere. People felt sorry for him. They saw his old, mismatched equipment, his faded work clothes, his quiet, solitary nature, and they assumed he was struggling, barely hanging on. They didn't see the black ink in his ledger book. They didn't see the growing balance in his savings account. They only saw that he wasn't keeping up, that he wasn't playing the game. He was a man out of time, a living relic of his father's generation, a generation that didn't understand that debt was no longer a wolf at the door, but a tool, a key to unlock a prosperous future. By the fall of 1979, the boom was at its peak. Land prices had quadrupled in less than a decade. The talk on the radio was all about feeding a hungry world, about endless demand from Russia and China. But there were other whispers too, if you listened closely. On the national news, they talked of an energy crisis, of lines at the gas pump, of an inflation rate that was creeping into the double digits. A man named Paul Volcker had just been appointed chairman of the Federal Reserve, and he was talking about a new, aggressive strategy to fight inflation, a strategy that involved something called monetary tightening. To most farmers, it was just noise, static from a world away. One cool October evening, Jed finished his last pass of fall tillage. He throttled down the 40-20, the engine settling into a low, contented burble. The sun had set, leaving streaks of orange and purple across the western sky. He climbed down from the seat, the smell of turned earth filling his lungs. It was a good smell, a smell of completion, of work done well. He stood for a moment, listening to the silence of the countryside. But it wasn't silent. From across the road, from Rich Miller's sprawling empire, came a steady, powerful hum. The yard lights on Rich's new machine shed cast a brilliant artificial glow into the twilight. He could see the headlights of his two big combines still out in the field, gobbling up the last of his soybeans, their massive engines roaring into the night. The sound carried on the crisp air, a relentless thrum of horsepower and progress. Jed looked at his own dark, quiet farmstead, then back at the blaze of light and activity across the road. For the first time, a sliver of doubt pricked at his resolve. Was he a fool? Was his father's advice truly from another time, a time that no longer existed? He felt a cold knot form in the pit of his stomach. The hum from Miller's farm suddenly sounded different. It wasn't the sound of success anymore. It sounded like a warning, a frantic, desperate race against a clock that only Jed could hear ticking. The change, when it came, wasn't a sudden clap of thunder, but a slow, sickening souring of the air. It began in the winter of 1980 with news that flickered across the small television in Jed's living room. President Carter, his face grim, announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union. To the men in Washington, it was a political move. To the farmers in the heartland, it was a gut punch. The price of corn, which had been the foundation of all that borrowed prosperity, fell off a cliff. The mood at the co-op turned from boisterous confidence to quiet, simmering anger. Men who had been planning their next big tractor purchase were now hunched over cups of coffee, talking in low tones about the price of fuel, the rising cost of fertilizer. Rich Miller was still there, still trying to project an aura of control, but the easy smirk was gone, replaced by a tight, forced smile. He talked loudly about forward contracting, about hedging his bets, but his eyes darted around the room as if looking for an exit. For Jed, the price drop was a problem, but not a catastrophe. He sold his corn for what he could get, took the smaller check, and adjusted his plans. The overhaul he'd planned for the engine in his old Chevy truck would have to wait. He'd make the old spark plugs last another year. He ate more from his own garden, bought less from town. His life was built on a foundation of solid ground, not shifting sand. Rich Miller's empire, however, was built on the promise of $3 corn. When the price cratered, the cracks began to show. The first sign was subtle. One of his massive International 1460 combines sat idle in the middle of a soybean field for 3 straight days during the peak of harvest. The problem wasn't a broken belt or a plugged auger, the kind of thing a farmer could fix with a wrench and some sweat. A hydraulic control module had failed, a sealed black box of wires and circuits that no one in the county knew how to diagnose, let alone repair. Rich had to call the dealer 100 miles away. They sent a specialized technician in a shiny service truck. The young man who stepped out wore a clean company uniform and carried a briefcase full of diagnostic equipment. He spent a day plugging gauges and meters into the combine's complex hydraulic system before announcing the verdict. The module was fried. A new one would have to be flown in from the regional parts depot in Moline. The final bill for the part and the service call was over $4,000. $4,000 to replace a part the size of a shoebox. Jed saw it all from his own field. He was out there on the old Gleaner E, the machine that Rich had once called a relic. It kept chugging along, its simple mechanical systems rattling and clanking, turning soybeans into money, however little it was. If something broke, Jed knew he could fix it himself with a welder, a hammer, and parts from the local Napa store. He watched the service truck finally leave Rich's field and saw the big red combine roar back to life, its lights cutting through the dusk as Rich raced to make up for lost time. He wasn't just losing time, Jed knew. He was hemorrhaging money. The real blow, however, came in the mail. It arrived in plain white envelopes, delivered to every rural mailbox in the county. In Washington, the Federal Reserve under Paul Volcker had declared war on inflation, and their weapon of choice was interest rates. Jed opened his bank statement and saw that the modest sum in his savings account was now earning an unheard-of 10% interest. He tucked the statement away. A few days later, he was at the parts store when he overheard two other farmers talking. One of them, a man named Bill Peterson, looked pale, his face drawn. "The letter came yesterday," he said to his friend, his voice barely a whisper. "From the PCA, my operating loan, it went from 9% to 18%, overnight. They said it could go higher." His friend just shook his head, speechless. 18%. It was usury. It was a death sentence. Jed thought of Rich Miller, his 1,000 acres, his 2 new combines, the Steiger tractor, the blue silos, all of it bought and built with bank money. Not fixed-rate money like his father had insisted on, for the farm mortgage paid off long ago, but variable-rate loans, the kind the bankers pushed because it protected them from risk. The risk was now being transferred in its entirety to the borrower. The hum from Rich Miller's farm began to sound different. The roar of his big machinery no longer sounded like progress. It sounded like the frantic buzzing of a trapped animal, chewing through borrowed time, burning fuel bought on credit, all to service a debt that was now doubling, tripling, growing into an insatiable monster that would soon devour everything in its path. The first cracks in the empire weren't just showing, they were splitting wide open, revealing the rotten foundation of debt that lay beneath. By 1983, the crisis was no longer a whisper, it was a roar. The green and white signs of farm auctions became as common as mailboxes along the county roads. They were like funeral notices, each one marking the death of a family's dream, sometimes a dream that had lasted for generations. The local paper was thick with foreclosure listings, columns of cold legal type that told stories of heartbreak and failure. The coffee shop talk was no longer about yields and rainfall, but about bankruptcies and nervous breakdowns. A dark cloud of fear and depression had settled over the heartland. Jed found himself at the bank one Tuesday morning, depositing a small check from the sale of a few hogs. The bank was quiet, the air thick with tension. As he stood at the counter, he saw Rich Miller emerge from the loan officer's office. Rich didn't see him. His gaze was fixed on the floor, his face ashen. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in the last 2. His shoulders were slumped, the confident swagger replaced by a defeated shuffle. The loan officer, a man named Henderson who was no relation to the family whose farm had been sold years before, followed him out. His face was a mask of professional regret. "I'm sorry, Rich," Henderson said, his voice low but carrying in the quiet bank. "We've extended it as far as we can. The collateral values have dropped too much. We have to call the note." Rich just nodded, a single jerky motion. He didn't say a word. He walked out the door, letting the heavy glass swing shut behind him, a man completely adrift. Jed finished his transaction and walked back out into the sunlight. He felt no sense of victory, no satisfaction in seeing his rival brought low. He just felt a profound sadness. Rich wasn't a bad man, just a proud one who had believed the gospel of the experts, who had trusted the system that was now chewing him up and spitting him out. Jed's own life during those years was an exercise in quiet defiance. While his neighbors were selling off cattle to make interest payments, Jed was breeding them. His costs were a fraction of theirs. His old John Deere 4020 sipped diesel compared to the big 4-wheel drives, and when it broke, he could fix it in an afternoon. His grain truck, the old red-primered Chevy, hauled his crop to the elevator without a monthly payment attached. His greatest asset was the number 0. 0 debt. He became a resource in the community. When a neighbor's cultivator broke a shank in the middle of planting, Jed was the one who fired up his welder and fixed it, refusing any payment other than a handshake. He traded his mechanical skills for things he couldn't produce himself. A side of beef from a neighbor who was a good cattleman but a poor mechanic. Help with roofing his barn from another. A quiet, informal economy emerged. a network of mutual support built on the old currency of trust and skill, a currency the banks couldn't devalue. The end for Rich Miller came in the spring of 1985. The auction was held on a cold, blustery day in March, the sky the color of lead. The scene was a grim echo of the Henderson auction nearly a decade earlier, but the mood was entirely different. There was no frenzy, no optimistic bidding. The crowd was thin, made up of somber-faced neighbors, a few opportunistic dealers from out of state, and the ever-present bankers in their clean coats. Jed stood at the back, just as he had before. The machines were lined up in a row, monuments to a fallen kingdom. The giant Steiger Panther, its green paint faded and tires caked with the mud of its last desperate season. The two international axial flow combines, their headers detached and resting on stands, looking like decapitated insects. The auctioneer's chant was flat, devoid of its usual energy. He knew there was no money in the crowd. The bidding was a massacre. The Steiger, which Rich had paid over $150,000 for, sold for $30,000 to a dealer who would haul it south. The combines, each worth well over $100,000 new, barely brought $25,000 apiece. It was a fire sale, and the bankers stood by with their clipboards, tallying the losses, their faces impassive. Rich was there, standing beside his wife near the porch of the house he had built. He wasn't the swaggering young man who had mocked Jed's old gleaner. He was a ghost, a hollowed-out man watching his life being dismantled piece by piece. He stared straight ahead, his eyes unfocused, as the auctioneer's voice droned on, selling off the tools, the shop equipment, the very substance of his identity. Jed watched for a while longer, then turned and walked back to his truck. The sight was more than he could bear. His father's words echoed in his mind, not with the ring of vindication, but with the heavy, somber toll of a funeral bell. The wolf of debt hadn't just stumbled Rich, it had torn him to pieces. The day after the auction, a profound quiet settled over the Miller farmstead. The yard, once a hub of roaring diesels and humming grain dryers, was now empty and silent. The big machine shed stood like a vacant cathedral, its doors gaping open. Jed was in his workshop, meticulously cleaning the carburetor from his small grain auger engine, when he heard a car pull into his lane. It wasn't Rich's shiny GMC pickup, it was a rusty 10-year-old Ford sedan with a mismatched fender. Rich Miller got out. He looked smaller, his work shirt hanging loose on his frame. He walked slowly toward the shop, his eyes on the gravel, and stopped a few feet from the open door. "Jed," he said, his voice raspy. He cleared his throat. I just came to say, you were right." Jed put down the carburetor body and wiped his hands on a red shop rag. He said nothing, just waited. "The bankers took it all," Rich continued, his voice cracking. "The equipment, the new land, everything. It still wasn't enough to cover the notes. They're taking the home place next. The 80 acres my dad left me." He finally looked up, and Jed saw the raw pain in his eyes. "They're selling it to some investment group from Chicago. They're just going to plow down the grove and the old barn. My grandfather built that barn, Jed." This was the moment for Jed to say, "I told you so." The moment to savor the victory he had so quietly earned. But looking at the broken man before him, all he felt was a shared sense of loss. The grief of a farmer seeing a piece of the land he loved fall into the hands of strangers who didn't know the soil, who didn't care about the history written on it. "When are they selling it?" Jed asked, his voice even. "Next week." "At the courthouse," Rich said, shaking his head. "Doesn't matter, it's gone." The following Tuesday, Jed put on a clean shirt and drove his old Ford pickup into town. He walked into the county courthouse, a place he'd only ever been to pay his property taxes. In a small, stuffy room, a bank official conducted the sale. There was only one other bidder, a man in a suit representing the Chicago investment firm. The bidding started. The man in the suit bid confidently, raising the price in crisp $5,000 increments. Jed stood silently, his hands in his pockets. When the bidding seemed to stall, Jed spoke for the first time, his voice calm and clear. He offered a price $500 higher. The man in the suit looked at him, annoyed, and raised it again. They went back and forth, Jed's bid small and steady, the investors large and impatient. Finally, the man in the suit reached his limit. He conferred with someone on his cell phone, then shook his head. "Sold," the bank official said, banging a small gavel, "to Mr. Jedediah Stone." Jed walked to the front and wrote a check. Not from a farm operating account, but from a personal savings account that had been slowly growing for over a decade. He paid in full. Cash. The banker who took the check looked at the account balance, then at Jed's calloused hands and simple work clothes, his expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. Later that afternoon, Jed drove out to the old Miller place. Rich was in the yard, loading a few personal belongings into the back of the rusty Ford. He looked up as Jed approached. "Heard you bought it," Rich said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Come to tell me when to be out?" "I came to make you an offer," Jed said. "The house is empty. You and your family can stay, no rent. For a year, maybe more, until you get back on your feet." Rich stared at him, his mouth slightly open. "Why? After everything, why would you do that?" "Because nobody from Chicago is going to care for that barn," Jed said, nodding toward the old structure. "And I'm going to need help farming this extra 80. I'll pay you a fair wage for your work." Tears welled up in Rich Miller's eyes. For the first time in years, the mask of pride and arrogance fell away completely, revealing the scared, exhausted man beneath. He couldn't speak. He just nodded, a deep, shuddering nod of gratitude. Jed had not come to gloat. He had come to offer grace. Word of what Jed had done spread through the county like wildfire. It was told over coffee at the co-op, over the counter at the hardware store, over the fence lines between farms. The narrative about Jed Stone changed overnight. He was no longer the stubborn fool, the man living in the past. He was the wise one, the man who had seen the storm coming when everyone else was admiring the sunshine. Old Frank Hemlock, the machinist, summed it up best one morning in his shop. "The university boys and the bankers, they sold everyone a ticket on a brand new ship," he told a group of farmers. "Jed Stone just stayed on the ark. Turns out the old ways knew a thing or two about floods." Years passed. The late 80s brought better rains and stable prices. The deep wounds of the farm crisis began to scar over. Rich Miller worked for Jed for 2 years, his old confidence slowly returning, tempered now with a hard-won humility. He eventually found a good job managing a large seed corn operation in the next state, and he left with his family intact and his dignity restored. He and Jed shook hands on the day he left, a bond of respect forged in the fires of failure and forgiveness. One warm summer evening, long after the crisis had faded into memory, Jed stood in his workshop. The place smelled of oil and old iron. His son, a boy of 10 with his father's quiet eyes, was standing on a stool, a grease gun in his small hands. Jed was showing him the Zerk fittings on the main axle of the old Gleaner E. "Every one of these is important," Jed said, his voice a low rumble. "You have to take care of the machine, and it'll take care of you. This old combine, it's not the fastest and it's not the biggest. But it's ours. Every bolt. No banker owns a single piece of it." He paused, looking at his son, whose hands were now covered in the same honest black grease that had stained his own for a lifetime. He put a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Your great-grandfather taught me something," he said softly. "He told me that debt is a wolf that's always at the door, just waiting for you to stumble. Some people will tell you that's old-fashioned. They'll tell you to get big, to borrow, to risk it all. But you remember this land. You remember this machine. If you can't hold the cash in your hand to pay for it, you can't afford it." The boy nodded, his expression serious. He didn't fully understand the weight of the words, not yet. But he would. Jed looked out the open shop door. The sun was setting over his fields, his original 160 acres, and the 80 next to it, with the old barn standing proud against the twilight sky. The land was healthy, the farm was solvent, and his family was secure. He hadn't built an empire. He had built a life on a foundation of his father's wisdom and the enduring strength of old, paid-for iron. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that it was more than enough.